The Honourable Taylor Martin.
Thank you, Mr Assistant President. I rise to oppose the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill 2021. The reasons for me opposing this bill are somewhat unchanged from when I spoke and voted against the 2017 Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill. Firstly, I do want to acknowledge up front the concept of assisted dying does resonate with many at face value or when initially prompted for their response in the community. I believe that it is because our heart aches when we hear about people who have had difficult end-of-life experiences. We have parents, spouses, siblings, friends who have suffered terribly in the final weeks and days of their lives, and we wish to take that pain away for them and for others. When people contemplate their own or their loved one's mortality, we hope their departure from this life will be swift and uncomplicated. When we witness the suffering of others or when we contemplate our own death, it is easy to reach the conclusion that we should allow any means to avoid such pain. I do not want to diminish this view because at its core, assisting those that we love, those around us, those in our community, is what it means to be human. To act on your emotions and to remove their suffering is to act out of compassion. For me, euthanasia is a step too far. No amount of process, procedure, forms or safeguards can completely eliminate the risk of this law being used by somebody who should not be taking their own life. We must consider all the consequences of the state effectively sanctioning suicide. We cannot consider just the heartache that comes from witnessing a loved one's pain. It is our obligation here as legislators to objectively consider all the outcomes and to strive to investigate to the best of our ability all the unintended consequences that would arise from legalising suicide, even in these circumstances. In participating in the Law and Justice Committee inquiry into the provisions of this bill, I was struck by a serious disconnect between the small, limited category of people that the proponents of the bill claim it is intended to benefit and the actual scope of the bill's provisions when examined in the light of the available data from other jurisdictions who have already legalised euthanasia. In the second reading speech of the Honourable Adam Searle in this place, he stated, and I quote, "The bill is about granting terminally ill people the right to make a choice about how they live in the final stages of their lives and how and when they wish to die when death is already certain. The people whose lives we are discussing are facing a certain death. Nothing is going to miraculously happen at the 11th hour to lift their suffering. The end is certain and it is tragic, painful and undignified." End quote. That's not exactly what the bill provides. The bill does not limit access to those in the final stages of a terminal illness. It applies to those with a 51% or more chance, i.e. the balance of probabilities of the likelihood of dying within either 6 or 12 months on the best guess of 2 non-specialist medical practitioners. The bill does not attempt to limit access to those whose imminent death is certain. The bill does not require that those people be facing a painful death, but only that the person be suffering. A careful examination of the bill's provisions show that there is a lack of definition of suffering, which means that while proponents focus on those people with allegedly unrelievable physical suffering, the actual scope of the bill includes access to a life-ending lethal poison for people with psychological or existential suffering, including suffering that could possibly be satisfactorily relieved with the right specialist help. Evidence from other jurisdictions which have already legalised euthanasia demonstrates that only a minority of cases of euthanasia involve concerns about pain, noting that even in the cases the person may not actually be experiencing uncontrolled pain, just worried about the possibility of future pain. For example, over 23 years of data from Oregon in the USA shows that less than 1/3, 27.4%, of those who ended their lives through euthanasia under its law had any concern about pain. In Quebec in 2020-2021, 24% of those whose lives came to an end through euthanasia requested this because of feelings of social isolation or loneliness, 24%. And as reported in the 2018 Death with Dignity Act report by the Washington State Department of Health, in Washington State in 2018, 9% requested a lethal poison to end their lives due to concerns about financial matters, including the cost of treatment or care. All these reasons would qualify as suffering under such a bill. And they do under similar legislation that currently operates in Victoria. As I said in 2017, and it is still the case, I belong to a demographic of people where the number one cause of death is suicide. It's a tragic, tragic problem that affects young people disproportionately, and it affects males disproportionately as well. For people aged 25 to 44, 23% of all deaths end in suicide, are due to suicide. For people even younger, those aged between 15 and 24, the proportion is even higher, with 37% of all deaths attributed to suicide in that age bracket. Mr. Assistant President, I've had several friends who have attempted suicide. Fortunately, through one way or another, that attempt was unsuccessful. Each of them in an effort to end their own suffering and helplessness from conditions such as depression. One of which in particular I have spoken about in this place before, in which I actually walked in on an attempt, fortunately at the exact moment in time where I could intervene and stop it from actually taking place. Of all the reasons why one should vote against legalising suicide, this is the one that troubles me personally the most. To legalise and to normalise suicide would, in my opinion, change the long-held view in society, the compact that we all have, that life is sacred and that we do not take away life in a civilised society. Studies show that this has been the case in jurisdictions where they have allowed this normalisation of suicide. In the US, suicides, specifically excluding euthanasia deaths, have gone up in many states, including Vermont by 24%, Montana by more than 15%, and Washington by 5%. Perversely, Clause 12(1) of the bill would provide that, and I quote, "For the purposes of the law of the state, a person who dies as a result of the administration of a prescribed substance in accordance with this Act does not die by suicide." This is such a dangerous proposition to not call something what it actually is. Normalising any form of suicide changes our view of death. It makes an acceptable alternative to physical and possibly mental pain. The proposition that was put forward by some participants in the Law and Justice Committee inquiry is that the availability of euthanasia somehow reduces suicide, and that is frankly absurd. This conclusion is not supported by the evidence from Victoria. When arguing for the legalisation of state-approved and funded assistance to suicide, the Minister for Health and Human Services at the time, the Honourable Jill Hennessy, claimed that, and I quote, "Evidence from the coroner indicated that one terminally ill Victorian was taking their life each week." Like the bill before us, the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act 2017, which she introduced on behalf of the Victorian Government at the time, excluded deaths by self-administration of a voluntary assisted dying substance for the purpose of causing a person's death from being considered as suicide. By this legal fiction, such deaths are then recorded as caused by the disease, the underlying disease of the patient, by illness or medical condition cited by a doctor in the application for a self-administration permit under the Victorian Act. Mr. Assistant President, I also want to raise the specific concerns that exist amongst older people, that they are uniquely vulnerable to the threat of euthanasia. Amongst older people, the threat comes in the form of coercion or possibly even from themselves fearing that they are a burden to their family and loved ones. The Law and Justice Committee inquiry heard from witnesses who said that the voluntary assisted dying poses a significant risk to vulnerable people in that they can be coerced or manipulated into accessing the scheme. The committee also heard that introducing euthanasia may send a dangerous signal to people who are sick, in that they may feel compelled to access the scheme because they felt like a burden to loved ones taking care of them. When most supporters of assisted suicide think about the pain and suffering that is being experienced, or the pain and suffering that will be experienced, they view it from the prism of how their own family and their own loved ones would approach this issue. But we must make the law for everyone in New South Wales. My colleagues and I are lucky to belong to the families that we do belong to. Others are not in that same situation. It is not far-fetched to imagine that this bill will result in people dying who should not otherwise. It is not hard to imagine a scenario where an elderly person who is incredibly sick and in terrible pain, yet still yearns for life, feels pressured by family to be assisted to suicide and to cease to be a burden. It is not far-fetched to imagine a scenario where somebody is given a terminal diagnosis when it may not actually be the case in the end. In Oregon, in 2019, their state health authority reported one key reason for doing so for nearly 6 out of 10 people who accessed the scheme, 59.2% of people as reported, was a concern about being a burden on their family, friends and caregivers. During the inquiry, we heard from Dr. Gregory Pike, Director of the Adelaide Centre for Bioethics and Culture, who outlined the thought process for sick or vulnerable people who may feel obligated to access voluntary assisted dying, and I quote, "It is not hard to see how mistakes might be made and how someone might slip through the net. People made to feel they really ought to go so as to stop burdening others, and made to feel that they are consuming resources that might be better spent. Lives made to feel that they have no remaining value, and so death becomes a benefit," end quote.